partnership between Queen's University School of the Natural Built Environment and Habitat for Humanity. And it is, of course, taking place as part of the wonderful One World Festival. This important event today will highlight the impact of disasters. We will discuss response approaches and the need for collective action in tackling disasters. Every year, natural disasters, war and civil unrest displace millions of people around the world from their homes. Habitat has 40 years of experience in community-based development and takes a partnership approach to disaster response, coordinating globally through the Interagency Standing Committee cluster system and interaction. When disaster strikes, the loss of home leaves families very vulnerable, and Habitat works to rebuild communities, moving them from ruin to recovery through a pathways to permanence approach. Our event this afternoon, and we're so thrilled that you can join us today, It's a Disaster, will feature Habitat for Humanity's International's Mario Flores, Director of Field Operations, Disaster Risk Reduction and Response, and James Schell, Resilience and Recovery Specialist, who is currently coordinating Habitat's response to the Beirut explosion. Now, the One World Festival itself, if this is the first event that you've joined in today, this festival aims to increase awareness of the global south. It aims to promote understanding of issues that affect the lives of the poorest people, and it aims to inspire action in our communities towards a just, peaceful and sustainable world. And you can find out more on all of the events still to come. There are still a number of days left at www.oneworldfestivalni.com. Now, if you are watching today, we'd love if you could tweet that you're tuning in from wherever you are today. We have a couple of hashtags that we're using for this event. Hashtag LoveQUB, hashtag It's a Disaster, and hashtag BuildSG. So what's going to happen now that we've got the housekeeping sorted, we're going to hear very shortly from Jenny Williams, the Chief Executive for Habitat for Humanity. Then we will have a couple of video addresses on behalf of Queen's University, and then we will get into hearing from our speakers. Our first speaker, of course, Mario Flores, and then James Schell, followed by our Q&A discussion. So once again, thank you so much for registering for the event today. You're in for a real treat over the next hour. But first of all, I'm delighted now to welcome all the way from Lisburn, Jenny Williams, Chief Executive, who's going to deliver the opening comments on behalf of Habitat for Humanity. Jenny.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's my privilege to welcome you on behalf of Habitat for Humanity here in Ireland. We're so thankful that the partnership with the School of the Natural Built Environment at Queen's has allowed us to bring you It's a Disaster, our key event in the One World Festival. Today we're focused on the extraordinary events which can strike in an instant, every year devastating lives and displacing millions of people from their homes. The reality that housing is critical in breaking the cycle of poverty drives Habitat's vision of a world where everyone has a decent place to live. For 1.6 billion people who will go to sleep tonight without a safe place to live, every day is a struggle to survive, already a kind of slow motion disaster which has been exacerbated by COVID-19. The One World Festival is an important opportunity to bring people together, to build solidarity and understanding in a world that's so divided by poverty and inequality. Over the last few months, as we have navigated the pandemic, I have heard so many people say they would like to start 2020 over again. There is no doubt it is challenging, but imagine how 2020 must be for families whose lives have been turned upside down by disaster. Most of us have moved on from the explosion in Beirut when the media did. Faced with our own challenges, we mightn't even have noticed that July's monsoon flooding in Bangladesh affected 4.7 million people and destroyed 1 million homes. And in India, the same floods affected 3.6 million people, destroying 500,000 homes. Habitat works every day in 70 countries to help vulnerable people and communities improve or build the places they call home, and helps build back better when disaster strikes. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm thankful that I have global colleagues, James and Mario, joining us as well, and we hope that you will keep in touch.
Jenny, thank you very much for that opening address. And I suppose a reminder too that there are people across the world really struggling today. 2020 has definitely been a difficult year for everyone, but for many families, you know, the world is a very difficult place, and that's what we're here to discuss today. Now we're going to watch a brief video address on behalf of Queen's University by, first of all, Professor Chris Johnson, Faculty Pro Vice Chancellor for the School of Electronics, Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Queen's University. And then we'll hear from Professor Greg Keefe, Head of School of the Natural Built Environment at Queen's.
Hi everyone, I'm Chris Johnson. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Engineering and Physical Sciences here at Queen's. I'd like to welcome you to the Habitat for Humanity Ireland meeting and also to this One World Festival. The topics that you're going to consider, I think, are incredibly important. Obviously, we are facing global challenges, not just from the pandemic, but from climate change. And I think that this is also incredibly important for me personally. I spent most of my adult life working on risk assessment and the engineering of complex systems. A lot of that work is informed by risk assessment, where the statistical analysis of past events provides us with predictions about future reliability and assessments about the way in which we have to engineer for failures. I don't think we can sustain some of those techniques anymore, with seeing failures that should have happened once every 50 years happening several times in a decade. And that is not just methodological challenges, but it raises more important challenges as to the nature of engineering and how we can sustain an optimistic and creative viewpoint into the future. So enjoy the rest of your meeting and good luck in the future. Bye.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the School of Natural Built Environment. My name is Greg Keefe. I'm Professor of Architecture and Urbanism, Head of School here at Queen's. The school itself is an interdisciplinary grouping of academics from the disciplines of geography, architecture, planning, archaeology and civil engineering. And it's a perfect place to understand the impacts we're having on our planet, especially during this period we know as the Anthropocene. Urban resilience, I see, is a wicked problem. It has people and the systems we create directly in the centre of the problem, but not only that, they're part of the problem. They can also be part of the solution, but to do that, it will need creative, holistic, innovative and interdisciplinary thinking that cuts across subjects and boundaries and takes us into new places. Resilience, after all, is not just about resisting change, it's about bouncing back with a new, improved trajectory to somewhere else, somewhere we didn't imagine. And I hope that you, through this webinar, find a new improved trajectory for yourself that will take you into a place where you can make the planet better for us all.
Professor Greg Keefe, Head of the School of the Natural Built Environment at Queen's, and before that you heard from Professor Chris Johnson, Faculty Pro Vice Chancellor at the School of Electronics, Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Queen's University. If you're just joining us now, you are very welcome to our It's a Disaster Habitat for Humanity event in collaboration with Queen's University School of the Natural Built Environment. And you're here just in time for our first keynote speaker who joins us today from Atlanta in Georgia. It is Mario Flores, Disaster Risk Reduction and Response for Habitat for Humanity. And Mario serves as Director of Field Operations, Disaster Risk Reduction and Response at Habitat for Humanity International. In his role, he provides global leadership and support to Habitat's affiliated entities, implementing risk reduction and humanitarian response programs. Mario has over 25 years of professional experience on shelter and human settlements, inclusive of WASH, and community development. Mario belongs to several global and regional collaborative networks and is a former co-chair of the Shelter and Settlements Working Group at Interaction, the largest coalition of US-based humanitarian and development organisations. He's a civil engineer with a postgraduate diploma on housing and human settlements from the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies, Erasmus University in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. Mario, thank you for joining us today. And I'm going to hand over to you, and I think you're going to share your screen and begin your presentation. Questions from Mario as well via the Q&A button if you're tuning in.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you this morning. I just want to make sure that you are looking at my screen. We're going to be discussing about pathways to permanence, which is the strategy, the generic strategy that Habitat for Humanity utilizes every time we go into humanitarian response mode. As it was mentioned, Habitat for Humanity, it's a non-profit organization, was established in 1976 as Habitat for Humanity International. We are based out of Atlanta in the United States, have a presence in the 50 states in the United States, and we have also operations in more than 70 countries. We do both development and also humanitarian response. And as Jenny mentioned before, our vision is a world where everyone has a decent place to live. So when it comes to decent housing, and when it comes to having a decent place to live, we know that disasters are one of the major setbacks to affordable and decent housing. And when disaster strikes, it's quite difficult to envision, how people that have been affected will go from a makeshift shelter to a permanent housing solution, going back to their normal lives. What you see on the left, it's a picture of a makeshift solution implemented by the survivors. It tells you about some reaction by the survivor, the ordeal that they just went through. And it also tells you that there is a level of capacities there that you can work with in terms of with the assistance by Habitat for Humanity. We call it Pathways to Permanence. It's a generic strategy, and it's defined as the process of reducing vulnerability, supporting disaster-affected families and communities, using holistic program interventions that enable incremental progress towards the achievement of permanent, durable shelter and settlement. It's kind of like the academic definition of pathways to permanence, but there are a number of things that I would like to have. It's not something that happens at once. It's rather a process, the process of sheltering, we call it. It also involves primarily reducing vulnerability, in the sense that when we go into a disaster response operation, we do not want to just rebuild all the risks and vulnerabilities that existed before the disaster, but would like to build back better, as you may have heard. We also talk about families and communities because our focus is not necessarily only on individual households, but we also look at a community as a whole. We look at neighborhoods, we look at multi-story buildings, we look at the surrounding areas, the entire habitat, whatever makes that community a livable place. We talk about holistic program interventions, meaning that it's not only shelter, but it's all the links that affect the shelter of the people. There is linkages between shelter and livelihoods, for example, between shelter and health, shelter and education, shelter and governance. There's a number of things that we look at. So we try to link our shelter interventions with those other sectors in order to have a more holistic process and enabling rather than directing, that incremental process. The way people build homes, the way people produce housing in the world, in the incremental process. In the developed world, we are used to seeing, finalized housing solutions built by a contractor, built by the formal sector. In the developing world, it's more of like a process. It takes a lot of time for a family to build little by little, step by step, making progress according to their income, to their capabilities. So we try to mimic in the response to a disaster in that process, which is incremental in nature. And in the end, we are looking at permanent and durable shelter as the end goal, but it doesn't happen in an instant. It doesn't happen right away. It's more like a process, going back to the definition of pathways to permanence. These are some of the guiding principles we try to apply when implementing a pathways to permanence strategy. We have the reduction of vulnerability at the center, as I mentioned. We want to build resilience because in many places in the world, disasters just happen to be cyclical. You could say that those are predictable disasters. For example, in the North Atlantic, there is a hurricane season every year. So you can bet the house that there will be at least 1 or 2 hurricanes affecting the Gulf of Mexico basin every year. If you look at South Asia, the monsoon season in India, where those big rivers collect the waters from the melting snows in the Himalayas and are enhanced with the heavy rains that are produced during the monsoon season. Pathways to Permanence also aims to be a participatory process. We try to involve the affected populations as much as possible in the designing their solutions and also in the implementation of programs. That can go from providing, labor, sweat equity, to also providing ideas and feedback so the program can be more adaptable to the culture and to the nature of the communities in which disaster has come. We try to avoid displacing families as much as possible, unless it's a situation like we had in Guatemala with a volcano eruption, which many of these areas were declared uninhabitable. So we have to relocate families. But that we look at that as the last resort, because we understand that families have already built a number of facilities with places where they live, and they know that are familiar places. Program design is centered on the pathways of the affected populations. There are a number of ways to go from homelessness to a permanent shelter solution. It's not going to be the same for all the families or for all communities. We also see shelter interventions that we implement in humanitarian response having a development mindset. So looking or having in the back of our minds when we are designing emergency programs, we have in the back of our minds the ideal end result or the ideal end stage of permanent housing. In that sense, Habitat for Humanity has to understand that we have a double role to play. One is as provider of interventions, and the other one is as an enabler of. And I also have to say that programs have to comply with global and local standards. We hold ourselves accountable to international accepted standards in humanitarian work, such as the SPHERE standards, such as the humanitarian, the core humanitarian standard, the code of conduct of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. All of that, it's also part of our design and informs every program that we put forward to help disaster affected populations. And we are also strong believers in coordination, both at the national level and also at the international level. Habitat is a member of the United Nations Global Shelter Cluster. We coordinate not only with donors, but also with other agencies implementing response. So we have better, that is part of the Pathways to Permanence strategy. Now, let me bring you to one of the most important things that we look at when implementing Pathways to Permanence. Let me take you to some 10 years back in time, to 2010. You may all remember the horrendous earthquake that affected Haiti in January of 2010. 230,000 people were dead like in a snap. And we had overall camps, spontaneous camps that appear all over the city of Port-au-Prince. A few weeks later, maybe 5 or 6 weeks later, we had another earthquake. This took place in February 2010 in the country of Chile in South America. We regretted 750 people dead and around 500,000 homes with partial damage. Not very many completely destroyed, but just damaged. The interesting thing is, if you look at the magnitude of the earthquakes, the magnitude for the Haiti earthquake was 7.0 Richter, and the Chile earthquake was 8.8. Richter scale, it's an exponential scale. So to say that the Chile earthquake was 500 times stronger and more powerful than the one in Haiti in the outcomes, the impacts, particularly when it comes to people who lost their lives. The question is, why is that? And the answer is quite simple. It totally refers to the context in which a disaster takes place. And that is the entry point for the Pathways to Permanence strategy. A careful analysis of the context. Kind of like if we were talking about pre-existing conditions, in each of the countries in which these affectations took place. And we need to look at a number of things from a number of sectors: environmental, social, economic, physical. You see them listed there on the slide. All of this is going to determine and is going to provide conditionality to the way that the affected population is going to be served and is going to be assisted. And Pathways to Permanence begins with a very careful analysis of the context. How do we do the affected population? Let me show you with this little graph here that we call the M&M slide. In normal times, you find people doing construction activity, like the one you see on the right of the slide. You also find people ideally also working on building resilience with the activities that you see on the left of the slide. But in the middle of all of this, you have a disaster coming in. So you quickly resort to what we call emergency. And one very specific thing that we want to see is where the affected population is located. Because right after a disaster, there are a number of options for the people, depending on the affectation of the area that they were living, or depending on the level of damage to their homes. You would find that they may have been evacuated to a center. You may find that they have gone to stay with a relative or a friend. You may find that they just, go and set up spontaneous camps, like what happened in Haiti after the earthquake. Sometimes the government set up camps. Sometimes they don't have any other option than to stay in their damaged home. So we, as part of the relief organizations and humanitarian organizations, Habitat brings a number of interventions or methods of assistance, we call them, to help these people. The idea is to have these provided or enabled in a way that will help going back or going towards a permanent housing solution. We usually see in the initial relief phases or recovery phases, as we call them too, that sometimes we have, in addition to the national coordination provided by the local government, we see the presence of international coordination. In many cases, the shelter cluster or many other clusters come into play. In order to think about permanence, you need to look at two very important components. The very first one is the land tenure situation. Because when you speak of permanent solutions, you need to resolve the issue of land, of tenure, because you're going to be building permanent structures. So these are some of the options. I have to warn you that this graph is not an exhaustive one. It's just for academic purposes. The other component we need to have resolved, if we're going to go into permanent reconstruction and development, is the issue of finance, where the money is going to come from. Is this going to come from donors or government or banks or remittances from family is staying abroad that sends money to the affected families. All of these, we need to have clarity. Once we understand or we have all this scenario well discussed and analyzed, then we can start tracing the pathways or potential pathways that we can use to assist families to go from disaster homelessness all the way to a permanent solution. And I will show you, 3 examples, very much simplified. I mean, this is very simplified. It's just for the purposes of presenting the strategy. For that project, in the Simon Pelé neighborhood in Port-au-Prince, we found the affected population in a spontaneous camp. We provided them with emergency shelter kits. Those were primarily tarpaulins and fixing elements so they could use the tarpaulin to cover a makeshift shelter. We then move on to build transitional shelters. Those were 20 square meter structures built of a wooden structure and using the same plastic tarpaulin as materials for wall and roof. Then we move on in a participatory process involving the entire community. We did a full end there, from street light to water points, to walkways, to bus stops, you name it, every single dwelling unit and how the disaster had affected them. And after that, we move into a process that we call community action planning, in which we identify the interventions that we wanted to see. The community came up very strong about solving some issues that they had with infrastructure, with community level infrastructure, like access to the community, the road, the street lighting, the drainage channels, all of that. So that is what we did in terms of provided a community grant. We did community contracting. The same community was contracted to do the work, and they did a lot. Move on to the earthquake in Nepal in 2015. In this case, in the Kavre district, we found people staying in their damaged homes. We performed damage assessments to understand the level of damages in their houses, if it was structural or the repair. We provided technical expertise, prepared budgets to do the repairs, identify what needed to be done, places to purchase materials. Most of the families had freehold land title, so there was no problem with tenure in this case. The government of Nepal, through the Reconstruction Authority, provided subsidies for the affected families to rebuild. And the process was implemented as an owner-driven reconstruction. The owner of the homes, they needed to hire labor or needed to hire a local contractor to do the repairs. And Habitat for Humanity provided the role of supervision and inspection of the houses affected before the next tranche of money could be the government. And that is the way that they got back into repair homes and a permanent solution. So this shows you in a very simplified way, again, how these families went from their post-disaster situation to going back into a permanent solution. And finally, the volcano eruption in Guatemala, that's in 2018. These families, we worked in this particular case with families who went to stay with relatives. In this case, the families receive support in the form of wash items. For example, we provided water filters, also cooking utensils to help families that were hosting others. We also had to work through the development of a new settlement here, because the places where these families came from were declared uninhabitable by the government. So we had to look for a new piece of land and develop that land. So in this case, the land situation, the tenure was solved by creating a new settlement. We provided grant subsidies for the construction. We had generous donors to provide money to build the new homes. We did the construction of new homes utilizing local contractors, and that's how families got into a new house, into new permanent solutions. So these are just 3 examples of how the strategy works. This is generic. We apply this every time there is a disaster. And as you're going to see in the next speaker, he's going to explain what we're doing in Lebanon after the Beirut explosion. But I hope that this will have provided you with an overview, very high-level overview of what we mean by pathways to permanence and how pathways to permanence contribute to that Habitat's vision of a world where everyone has a decent place to live. Thank you very much.
Mario, thank you very much. Very insightful and extremely interesting. And yes, a little bit of a delay coming through, but we heard every single word. So thank you for joining us today from Atlanta in Georgia. Next, we head to Geneva for our second speaker. Remember, you can send questions in for your speakers via the Q&A option on Zoom here today on this webinar. And I know questions are coming in. We'll get to those shortly. But our next speaker today is ready to go now, and that is James Shell, Resilience and Recovery Specialist for Habitat for Humanity's international focal point across Europe, the Middle East and Africa. James has been involved in humanitarian and development programming over a 15-year period, working with the Red Cross, various NGOs, and previously leading Habitat for Humanity Australia's international program in support of shelter, water and sanitisation, urban slum upgrading and resilience programs across Asia Pacific. He's completed a postgraduate degree in humanitarian and development assistance and is currently studying a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning. James is also currently coordinating Habitat's response to the Beirut explosion. James, I'll hand over to you now, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Afternoon and good morning, colleagues. Yeah, as I echo Mario's words, it's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to some discussion in the next 15 minutes. So I'm conscious of the time and to leave some discussion. So I would say over the next 10 minutes or so, 10 minutes, let's say, I'd just like to speak a little bit about the Beirut port blast that I'm sure many of you are aware of, and hoping you can see the slide in front of you. If not, give me a yell. So just to highlight, let me just move this, just to highlight, as I'm sure you're aware, on August 4th, there were nearly 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate that exploded in the port of Beirut. And this is a port that is located centrally within the city, that left nearly 200 dead, 600,000 injured, and significant destruction. And I'm sure many, if not all of you, had seen some of the videos of the detonation, which is extremely confronting. But I think what's unique with the case in Lebanon is this is what you could say is a compounding crisis. So Lebanon has a population of approximately 6.8 million. 1 million of those are categorized as living under the poverty line. There are 1.5 million registered Syrian refugees living predominantly in cities and towns such as Beirut that have placed extreme pressure on services, on city services, electricity, water, waste management. This is all pre-blast. I'm sure some of you have been following the news over the last 6 to 9 months, the quite significant political instability and the associated economic instability, which resulted in the local currency, the Lebanese pound dropping or devaluing around 80%. And so what the implications of this is for families and their need for food, education, pay for health services. Those prices suddenly skyrocketed. So you've got all of this, and then the explosion that we see had occurred on the 4th of August. And I'm sure you've read on the screen in front of you, but that destruction was significant. 30,000 apartments with what we would consider light damage, 17,000 moderate, and over 1,000 have significant structural damage, which essentially means these buildings need to be destroyed, well, demolished and rebuilt. And many of these have quite significant cultural heritage too. So this is the backdrop. For the next minute, I'm going to share with you a video. It doesn't have sound. If it works, fantastic. If not, we'll move on. But it's footage care of the Guardian of well, it's drone footage. So perhaps I'll narrate a bit of it, but it's essentially capturing some of the devastation to you can the office blocks and residential apartments such as this here. Now these apartments were situated, as you'll see quite soon, quite close to the port, and with the shockwave, essentially anything that wasn't extremely structurally strong was shattered or significantly compromised. Windows, doors, interior walls, ceilings, voila, there you go. So I'll move on before it goes to the next. So there was some short footage. There are just a few pictures here that more to give you a visual of some of what we're seeing. So these were taken by our team on the ground, and I actually would like to say, so as Sarah mentioned, I'm based in Geneva in Switzerland working remotely, but we have a team of Habitat staff and partner staff, which I'll speak to shortly, who are out and about every day in quite stressful contexts and situations, trying to support affected families and communities, every day. So I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that. But as you can see on the pictures here, we're looking essentially at households whereby majority of, in cases, external walls have been totally destroyed. And often the families themselves have already cleaned up, removed the rubble, tried to come to some sense of, I wouldn't even say normalcy, but to be in a position where they can either self-repair or are ready to work with agencies such as Habitat and others, or government, or private contractors to rebuild their homes or their apartments. And as we'll speak to shortly, very often it's rebuilding apartments that they don't own, but that they are renting. And I'll unpack that nuance shortly. So here are some pictures to start to tell some of the story. Okay, so if we have that as the backdrop, what is Habitat for Humanity doing? So these next few slides will start to really unpack that. So maybe some context. So Habitat has been active in Lebanon for about 20 years now. A small, lean team. And Habitat is one of, especially now, quite a large number of agencies that are responding to health, to shelter, to water and sanitation issues. And especially in the last, 8 to 10 years, many agencies supporting poor and vulnerable Lebanese and Syrian refugees. So there are quite a lot of actors. And so with that, you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner, Habitat's logo, and in the bottom left-hand corner, Catholic Relief Services. So for this response, Habitat is working with Catholic Relief Services. Many of you may know of Caritas, of Caritas Ireland, or your local Caritas branch, and it's essentially that. CRS are part of the Caritas International Network. And they've been working with, they have an established program in Lebanon and have been working with local partners over half a decade to support their subsequent capacity for programming, for governance, to essentially become stronger, more impactful organisations, and these are local organisations. And so our program is in partnership with CRS, and to do these 2 points that you see in front of you. And first and foremost is to support affected households, or to support households that have been affected by the blast. And for Habitat, as essentially a shelter agency, the way we do that for this response is through shelter repairs and rehabilitation. So this is really our core. In addition to that, what we want to do is Noting strong capacity and a vibrant local civil society in Beirut, we want to support this. So a lot of our focus is also how can we not just do our work, but support local agencies to do this kind of work better and more sustainable in the future. So these are our two objectives, and those three circles you see is essentially our approach to support at a household level, to make some impact and change at a neighbourhood level, and at a broader civil society level. I'll speak to each of those, I'm just conscious of time, shortly. Here, I won't speak to this, but just so you see is a small snapshot of agencies and local agencies, I'll say, we're working closely with. There are these 4 circles, and the first grey circle on the left there are agencies that we are providing technical and financial assistance to repair homes. We've got a larger range of agencies that we will be providing dedicated technical assistance to, which I'll speak to shortly, and broader civil society, which this will be in the coming months. How can we support additional agencies with the resources that we have, again on shelter, but on other points that I'll speak to shortly. So I'm going to go through each of these bubbles very briefly and a little bit more into the nuance. So if we're looking at families and homes, with the current resources that we have, our aim over the next 4 to 5 months is to support 250 households with light or medium repairs, as you see in front of you. And that relates to windows and doors, building facades, ensuring that these homes, especially coming into winter, that they're weatherproof and that they can be closed off to the elements and they can be secure. This is really key. It has significant protection issues for often quite vulnerable families, and a lot of the families and households that we will be working with are either, well, a mix between female-headed households, a number of child-headed households, Syrian refugees, some documented, others undocumented, so quite vulnerable. So this is who we are prioritizing, in this response. So to be honest, the vast majority will be light repairs. We will also look at what we're terming moderate repairs, and this is, as you can see, walls and ceilings. Access to water and sanitation. So a lot of the time, the building's water supply was damaged. So a lot of these apartments have water tanks at the top of those buildings, and a lot of those were damaged or significant or destroyed. And so it's ensuring that the water supply can be reinstated, and similar with sanitation. So this is at a household level. Moving forward, we're conscious of, you work at a household level, but how much of my time do we spend outside of the house, in the communities that we are embedded in and that surround us? And so what we're also trying to do is how, with the resources we have, can we support the surrounding neighbourhood? A couple of ways that we're doing that through this program is, one, repairing shop fronts. We're essentially supporting the resumption of markets and small businesses. A lot of these businesses, mum and dad businesses, if I can use that term, they don't have a lot of capital, they don't have a lot of liquidity. What can we do to help them reinstate their business and offer their service, whatever that might be, food, repair, whatever it might be, contracting certain products to their respective neighbours. So this is one. Rehabilitating communal spaces. So this really looks at, well, you can see their parks, walkways, community centres. What we're really conscious is every community has a social fabric. It has a flavour. It's unique. And what we're hoping to do is, in our program, to support the revitalisation of that neighbourhood, or to get it back to where it was before, at the least. So this is really key for us. And for the details of here, we're not, to be open, is not defined yet. Our focus now is on households, getting these households and families safe and secure. We will then move towards, okay, what can we do at a neighbourhood level to ensure that the social connection, the social fabric is retained? And what is so key with this is working with the municipality and community groups. There is a risk that the humanitarian sector can work in isolation on occasion. So what we are consciously aware of, acutely aware of, is to embed and ensure our programs speak to and contribute to what are the existing priorities of that neighbourhood, as communicated by community groups, the municipalities. So this is key. And something that Greg Keith mentioned at the beginning just highlighted this to me. He mentioned speaking to urban resilience and the need for intersector and innovative programming. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. But again, not to have that pre-cooked. We have some ideas, but these need to be driven by the needs and the capacities of the neighbourhoods that we're working in. So those are the first two bubbles. Just two or three slides more max on my slide, just so you're aware. So this last bubble is that you could say the broader bubble: families and communities, neighbourhoods, broader civil society. And what our intent here is more of what Mario mentioned, enabling. So the first two bubbles that you've seen are a lot of construction, a lot of hardware, a lot of rebuilding. What this last bubble, which we would term an objective, relates to how can we provide technical assistance to our partners, our local partners that are already working, and will have, to be honest, have been working since day one to support families. We've identified 4 areas that, as Habitat and CRS and our partners, we will be providing support to the broader sector. Construction standards: we have a team of technical engineers with strong capacity locally and globally. But 2 I'd like to highlight, and even one, that second last one, housing, land and property rights. So just to speak to this really briefly, many of the families that have been affected by the blast, not all, but many, poor or vulnerable Lebanese or Syrian refugees, many or some of these families, but a significant percentage, either don't have documented tenant agreements or rental agreements, or they're just verbal or even less. So risks of eviction is high. In a period where there's a lot of reconstruction happening, there is a potential for property developers to look to capitalise on this, which can result in essentially enforced evictions. And there's some progress that's being made with the relevant departments in government departments in Lebanon to reduce this risk. But if people aren't aware of their rights, they're at risk of being evicted, even if they are required or able and have the right to stay. So a big focus of us is to try to support partner agencies and families directly to ensure that they're aware of their housing, land and property rights, and can advocate for those rights. I was going to speak to urban recovery, but I'll skip that, just conscious of time. But I would just refer back to that comment from Greg Keith, talk about the need in urban recovery for inclusive, intersector, kind of innovative programming. And our intent is to do this, is that last bottom you see there, that last line, sorry, you see there, through various ways: mentoring, developing guidance, such as, this is my last slide. And I wanted to end on this and circle back. Obviously you saw this through Mario's presentation before, and I wanted to show how this speaks and contributes to exactly what you saw with Mario's slide. I was wondering if I took you on the journey, but just to highlight, what you're seeing in front is how we're supporting families. So it's just talking about that first bubble. Families are staying in their homes in the vast majority of cases, not all. We're undertaking damage assessments. Based on that, there's a mix of, do we just need to provide some technical guidance and assistance to this family, or do we need to help repair their home with them and with contractors? So it's this journey. A lot of the tenure context is private rental, and I just mentioned those risks. We will be supporting through grants and either through working through local contractors or providing cash directly to families and to say, working with us, you can choose who to work with and you can choose what you need to best suit your shelter needs at this point. So I just wanted to highlight one example. I'm up time-wise, so thanks very much. I'll end there, and Sarah, back to you.
James, thank you. And sorry we've only had such a short time with you because your presentation is just so interesting. Questions are coming in and we are in the closing minutes. So I'm going to bring Mario back. If you could pop your camera and microphone on again, Mario. James, we'll just stay with you there because you were talking in the final stages of your presentation there about the real challenges for you at the minute, given the political and economic crises. And, you know, one question that's come in is how does Habitat's work in Beirut ensure, or can you ensure, that the support is reaching the people who need it most?
Thanks, Sarah. Sure. First and foremost, we are going essentially in the neighbourhoods we're working in, house to house. Or apartment to apartment in this case. Working through every building and every apartment block and speaking to those families that have had shelter damage, identifying, or essentially going through assessment, identifying their specific context, what's their economic capacity, to get an overall picture. Let's say we have 100, for argument's sake, 100 families or households that we have seen. We will identify based on a criteria who are the most vulnerable. And again, often it's female-headed households, those that are either unemployed or child-headed households, people living with a disability. There's about 12 or 13 criteria that we use to guide how we select families. So I'll stop there.
Okay, yes, extremely challenging, but thank you for answering that question so well. Mario, if we bring you back in, a question has come in from an anonymous attendee today. You talked very much about the Pathways to Permanence strategy. Both of you talked about that. What our questioner wants to know is, how does the Pathways to Permanence strategy incorporate the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, I forgot to mention that in the specific presentation, but SDGs refer to, especially SDG 13, I think it is, and 11, refer to building safe environments and building resilience in urban areas. And in this particular case in Lebanon, that is what we're doing. Pathways to Permanence it's also feeds from a number of global. One of them is the new urban agenda, and the other one is the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And we inform our strategy by elements of that, even though those agendas are primarily directed at national governments, but we understand that is the role of international non-governmental organizations such as Habitat to support in achieving those objectives. So we definitely have the SDGs in mind, and especially the ones referred to shelter, access to safe water, and sanitation.
Okay, thank you for that. And one more for you, just coming in there from Pete Graham at the minute. This is slightly a wider issue. In your experience, how have you seen the impact of climate change on the amount and intensity of natural disasters, for example, such as the recent floods in Bangladesh and in India?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing that, and not only in India, but also, you know, the intensity and the increased number of the latest season in the North Atlantic hurricane season. You know, we ran out of names for the storms. We're using names from the Greek alphabet. You know, we're talking about hurricane that just hit, you know, the Gulf Coast last week. So that tells you that climate change is really having an impact, not only in the number, but also the intensity. If you take a look at the track of losses from 30, 40, 50 years ago, you're going to see a trend, a number of events, and the intensity of these events. So that's got to tell you something, you know, that coupled with what we're seeing in terms of even critically asking people telling you, we have never seen this before. You know, we have never seen a storm of such intensity, or we never used to get, you know, violence part of the country. I mean, there's a number of things that points towards climate change as a main driver.
Okay, thank you very much to Mario. I'm just looking at the clock now. I don't know if I have time for this. Very quickly, James, there's a questions come in from Dr. Niall Majuri at Queen's. Which types of partners are often the most challenging to work with in rolling out a partnership approach to disaster recovery?
That's a great question. Again, conscious of time. Which partners? I would say what we have been doing with Habitat and CRS is attempting to work with partners that we have a pre-existing relationship with. And by extension, those that we have a pre-existing relationship with, we are aware of how they work, what guides their humanitarian work, that it's based on need, not based on specific demographics or religious belief, that their processes in relation to contracting and finance. So to be honest, a lot of it comes down to organizational mission, vision, governance, and processes. And to therefore be on the front foot with working with local partners over a long period with any partner over a long period of time will give us confidence to kind of continue that journey. And the risk is, the last thing I'll say is often when we find ourselves in a situation when we need to find new partners, you haven't had the luxury of time or resources to go through that process, and that becomes a risk.
Thank you very much. A great question to end on. Thank you so much to James and to Mario, our speakers today on our fantastic event. I'm just seeing as well that Conor Graham from Queen's has also got access and can share access to open source satellite imagery covering the timeline of the Beirut damage, which could be very interesting for everyone. If anybody is interested, they can email and access that footage. We have run out of time. I'm going to let you all head off. Thank you so much for joining us today. Remember, this video will be available, and you can follow and get details of this along with any answers to any questions we didn't get to. If you want to send in a question now, we can follow up with those emails. A reminder that our event today has been a collaborative venture between Geography at Queen's and Habitat for Humanity, an undergraduate module, Geography at Work, which offers final year students an opportunity to work with a range of civic organisations on pro bono research projects. Very much needed in the world. Thank you so much to the Public Engagement Office at Queen's for their support in making this event happen. You can connect with Habitat's work here and at home and globally at www.habitat.co.uk, including you can also get a copy of our Housing Ensures Sustainable Development booklet. There are other One World Festival events taking place. I have another one coming up later on this evening with Concern this time. But thank you to our speakers today. Thank you for joining, and take care. Enjoy the rest of your day and keep up the great work, guys, in the work that you do to help families less fortunate than ourselves. Thank you so much. Good afternoon.